Hello all. It's been a couple of days since I've done a video, um, mostly because I was working. A few things have transpired, or transgressed, if you will, in the interim. Tonight, the governor of Minnesota, the esteemed Tim Walz, has announced that he has lifted, or is allowing to expire, the stay-at-home order on Sunday night, as it was set to expire for Monday. The problem is he hasn't really changed anything. His announcement was that he's going to allow it to expire, but put in place some new rules, some new standards, and some of those standards are that, for lack of better terminology, nothing's changed. Non-essential, non-critical, if you will, businesses are going to be allowed to open at 50% capacity as long as they have met with standards, health and safety standards. They have to come up with a health and safety plan. I guess we could sit here and argue about that until the cows come home, really. The problem with that is that he's really overstepped his bounds. Again, overstepped his bounds. And here's the deal. Places like salons, places like barbershops, restaurants, bars, things like that, they're not allowed to be open still. They're still not allowed to be open. And so a lot of people in the state of Minnesota are rejoicing. They're very thrilled about what they've heard. And so I guess what I want people to think about is not just how are you impacted by this. So like if this is great news for you, that's great. If that means you get to go back to full-time work on Monday and go back to earning your living, that's phenomenal. As I've said in recent weeks, it would have been very easy for me to sit at home and not comment at all on any of this stuff because I have been gainfully employed since all of this started. I haven't lost a single cent of income. I've been gainfully employed, and I've also been actively involved in pushing back against these standards, pushing back against these governmental decrees that have been put out. Not because I've been personally impacted in the sense of my economic safety and well-being, but because, for the most part, I'm concerned about my neighbor. So I made a post on my personal Facebook page earlier tonight saying that I am not interested in remaining friends with or remaining close to any Christian who uses Romans 13 as justification for defending the actions of any of these wicked rulers. Because I've gotten that. I've been told you need to be subservient to the rulers because God has placed them over you, and therefore the best thing for you to do, Todd, is to basically sit down, shut up, and submit. And my problem with that, my concern with that is the things that they're doing, one, aren't just. They're not righteous. And Romans 13, 1 through 7 is very clear that the acts of ruling officials, and in the case of the United States, the elected servants, according to the Constitution, they rule with our consent, with our permission, if you want to use the term rule. They serve with our consent, with our permission is a better way to say it. They're not abiding by the supreme law of this land, the Constitution. And so I've been beat up for my position on this by many people. But see, I'm the consistent one here. I'm consistent. The rest of you aren't. If you're all in favor of all of these things that are going on and you're claiming to be a Christian especially, you're not consistent. Because the things that the governor of Minnesota has been doing, and the governors of places like California and Michigan and Ohio and Illinois and Kentucky, California, and other places, these are the acts of wicked, evil, God-hating enemies of the church. And we saw that played out especially in Minnesota this night alone, Governor Walz made a decision to allow non-essential, non-critical businesses to operate at 50% capacity, but has continued to stifle by fiat, by his rule, if you will, the gathering together of the saints for worship, when there's no tangible evidence at all that the church or anybody else is in any greater danger from meeting than people who gather at Walmart, or people who gather at Lowe's or Home Depot or Hy-Vee or any of the other grocery stores. Whether you're familiar with the names of the grocery stores or not isn't important. What is important is that this is all arbitrary, and it is stifling. And here's the other kicker. Right now, this isn't being applied equitably. The Islamic religion is in the midst of Ramadan right now, and so they fast from before sunrise in the morning until after sunset or at sunset at night, and they all gather for meals. And part of that is gathering for a meal in large groups. And I can attest for a fact, in the city of Rochester, there are several places where large groups of Muslim men are gathering and being served in groups that are well over 10. Well over 10. And the wicked, evil, leftist, God-hating mayor of Rochester, Minnesota is defending their actions, making excuses for them. And yet our governor, who has ordered that no religious gatherings take place, isn't saying a thing. He's not saying a thing. Now, as a Christian and as a constitutionalist, I applaud the ability of members of the Islamic faith, whether I agree with their practices or not, whether I agree with their religion or not, doesn't matter. I applaud their freedom in the United States to exercise their religion according to the Constitution. We can have another conversation about their theology and their doctrine and all of that. But I applaud that in the United States they're free to practice their religion. But here's the problem. It's not being applied equitably. They're being allowed to do those things. Christians are being told they can't. Because our governor, Governor Walz, has continued to impose ridiculous, evil sanctions on everybody, but it's especially being applied to churches because, for the most part, let's just admit, within Minnesota, whether it's Christian as a whole or not, or whether it meets the standards of Orthodox Christianity, Christianity is the religion of Minnesota. If you're going to have a religion, Christianity is that religion, whether it be mainstream or more conservative, Orthodox, Reformed types, or megachurch types, or whatnot. Christianity is that religion, and it is being restricted in ways that the Muslims aren't. They're not being restricted. And so while this may not be persecution per se, it is definitely a lack of equitable application of the governor's orders and equitable application of the First Amendment to all people. Period. And our governor has continued to say you are still not allowed to meet in groups of larger than 10. And that goes for religious gatherings, but it's not being applied. So I've heard a lot tonight. I've been reading commentary, quite a bit of it, over the last several hours since the governor spoke at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. I have been reading comments about people applauding his decision because they're finally going to be free. They're going to be free. Folks, you were free this entire time. It was just you were too much. How do I want to say this without coming... You know what? I'm not even care if I come off as a jerk at this point. You were too much in line with government think. That's the problem. You were too much in line with government think. And so now you're applauding our governor for giving your freedoms back to you. No, you always had your freedoms. You were just terrified because you were facing fear and you caved into it for the sake of your own well-being. And so far, nothing's produced. Our governor has used false, fallacious numbers over and over and over and over again to continue to kowtow people and beat them into submission, to follow his rules. And finally, people are starting to rise up. And let's just be honest, there's no way in the world he isn't aware that places like Wisconsin, the governor there lost the lawsuit that was filed against him. People told him enough's enough. They sued, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, ruled against the governor of Wisconsin. So our governor at least saw the handwriting on the wall. But here's where I'm going with this. Everybody's applauding the graciousness and the mercy of the governor of Minnesota. And here's the issue. And I'm going to read some passages from Scripture. And so I know that this isn't for everybody. So if you happen to see this in a group that's not explicitly Christian, I'm fine with that. I'd love to hear your pushback and your challenges on the intermixing, if you will, of religion and constitutional issues. Because quite frankly, and I'm sure there will be a video coming out about it, there's no way to have the Constitution without the Christian religion. You want to remove Christianity from the Constitution? You want to remove Christianity from the United States? Your Constitution is going to crumble. So even if you're a conservative atheist or a libertarian atheist, you take away Christianity from the Constitution, you got nothing without us. You've got nothing without the holy book of the Christian faith. So anyway, I'm going to read this. Whether or not you agree doesn't matter to me. What does matter is the principle that's taught here. So in Proverbs chapter 12, starting in verse, I'm going to start in verse 9. It doesn't, Proverbs are interesting. There's not context necessarily in every proverb. The Proverbs are that. They're Proverbs. That's kind of why we call them what we call them, or that's where we get the term proverb. So starting in verse 9, Proverbs chapter 12 reads, "Better is he who is lightly esteemed and has a servant than he who honors himself and lacks bread. A righteous man has regard for the life of his animal, but even the compassion of the wicked is cruel. He who tills his land will have plenty of bread, but he who pursues worthless things lacks sense. The wicked man desires the booty of evil men, but the root of the righteous yields fruit. An evil man is ensnared by the transgressions of his lips, but the righteous will escape from trouble. A man will be satisfied with good by the fruit of his words, and the deeds of a man's hands will return to him. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man is he who listens to his counsel, or to counsel. A fool's anger is known at once, but a prudent man conceals dishonor. He who speaks truth tells what is light, but a false witness, deceit." All of that's very important, but the part I want to go back to is verse 10. In the last half of verse 10, we read, "But even the compassion of the wicked is cruel." Governor Walz showed compassion tonight in his speech. And that's his assertion, I'm sure. And there would be many of his supporters who would assert that as well. There'd be many supposed Christians who would assert that Governor Walz was being compassionate and merciful and gracious to the people of Minnesota by putting all of these things into play and into place. But I've got news for you. It was wickedness. It's cruel. Governor Walz is not a righteous man. Governor Walz is not a good man. No one is good. No, not one. But Governor Walz is not a good man. Governor Walz has demonstrated over and over and over again his lack of support for the life of the preborn children of this state, his lack of support of defending their lives. He has said he was doing what he was doing to save lives in Minnesota, but the very people that it should have been saving are the ones that have been dying in Minnesota. The people who are locked in long-term care facilities, away from their friends and family, and away from people who love them the most. And yet they still die. And yet he continues to restrict the religious practices of all but a handful of people in the state of Minnesota. He also is, in his mercy, in his compassion, he is harming the business owners who still can't open, who still run the risk of being shut down, like the barber from the Twin Cities, who lost his business, basically, because he dared to defy the governor's edict, his unconstitutional and unlawful edict. The governor of Minnesota is an enemy of the people and his compassion is cruel. Because as he acknowledged in his speech tonight, Governor Walz acknowledged his decisions have ruined thousands of lives in the state of Minnesota. Thousands. Now, he didn't use those numbers, but he said he knows that these were hard decisions that had to be made, and he's very, very sorry, but he had to do what was best for the state. He didn't do what was best for the state. He executed his idea of compassion, and it was cruelty in the eyes of God. It is time for Christians, that would be especially elders of churches, pastors of churches, to stand up and say, enough's enough, Governor. We are not bowing to you. We're not bowing to you, Nebuchadnezzar. We're not bowing to you, Caesar. We are going to do what we have been commanded to do, and we're going to meet. And then for those of you who aren't Christian, but you are patriots and constitutionalists, it is time for you to stand up and take back your state. Now, not on June 1st, not at the end of this month. Take it back now. Open up your business. Open it up. Churches, open up. Christians, stand up for those who are being oppressed. Stand up. Stop being cowards. Stop being worried about your 501c3 status. Stop being worried about whether or not you're going to be silenced because you dared to tread on the sacred state ground of politics. Forego your tax-exempt status. Forego your protection from the state. The state is your enemy. The governor of Minnesota is the enemy of the church. And we should be praying for his salvation. We should be praying for him to be healthy and well, and we should not be wishing any ill will on him at all. But he is an enemy. He is a power who is in place. No arguments. No one's in a position of power in this country or any other country in the world without being put there by God to some degree or another. They're all there for a reason. But as Calvin said, when God wants to judge a nation, and I will say when God wants to judge a state, he grants that nation or that state wicked rulers. That is Governor Tim Walz. It is time for the Christians of this country, especially Reformed Christians, especially Protestant Christians, Calvinistic Baptist, Presbyterians, Lutherans, conservative Lutherans. The left-leaning Lutherans are far gone, and so are the left-leaning Baptists and the left-leaning Presbyterian types. But it's time for Orthodox Presbyterians and Orthodox Lutherans and Orthodox Baptists, Calvinistic Reformed types, to stand up and remember their heritage in the Black Robe Regiment that helped start the battle for freedom in what became the United States. It's over if we don't do that. Churches have to get back to speaking on social and political issues, even if it means they lose everything. We need to defy tyrants. God has granted us that authority. God has granted us that permission to stand up to the oppressor and watch out for the oppressed. It is time for us to act. 2 more weeks is not good enough, because as the governor announced tonight, he reserves for himself the right to take it all back at any time. Stand up, Christians. Stand up now. As always, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for being open-minded. Thanks for listening. I would ask that over here in the corner, somewhere on your screen, you hit the subscribe button. It's important, not for me, but because mainstream media, legacy media, isn't going to get the word out. They're not going to let people who don't toe the established line speak. So for the sake of liberty and for the sake of the defense of this nation, small little independent voices like mine need to be heard, especially the interviews. It's got very little to do with my commentary and a lot more to do with the interviews and the people who are affected when liberties are tread on. So once again, hit the subscribe button, like, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much.